Welcome back to another Classic Game Room competitive review, and this one is pretty serious. Potentially controversial, one might say, because today I will be competitively reviewing the Sega Genesis controller versus the Super Nintendo controller. Let the console wars of the 90s return. Which controller is better for playing your favorite video games? Well, if you have a Sega Genesis, I would recommend the Sega Genesis controller. And if you have a Super Nintendo, I would recommend buying a Sega Genesis and playing the games with the Sega Genesis controller. But beyond that, which controller is better? Well, they're both excellent, obviously. They look cool. One of them looks cooler than the other one. Not going to say which one that is, but one of them definitely has that awesome blast processing fueled style. One of them. This is what happens when you leave Sega and Nintendo controllers together unattended, babe. They frolic and get tangled. It's possible that I'm slightly biased, but these are both great controllers for two of the best 16-bit video game consoles of all time, the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo. Really, you can't go wrong with either. Now, some might argue that the Super Nintendo controller is better because it has more buttons, and this is true, it does have more buttons. You can get different Sega Genesis controllers, like the 6-button controller, but this one already has 6 buttons, 6 main buttons, so that you can play Street Fighter 2, of course. 3 buttons just doesn't cut it for Street Fighter 2. So if we take the number of buttons into consideration, the Super Nintendo controller does come out ahead, although it's always kind of weird using the front L and R button to kick or punch or whatever. I just jumped around with Chun-Li all the time and kicked people in the head. I'm not really a huge fan of the Western Super Nintendo color scheme. I actually prefer the original Nintendo Famicom, Super Famicom design. The purple is just frankly not all that exciting, but from the aesthetic standpoint, the Super Nintendo controller is comfortable. It fits my hands nicely, and all the buttons are easy to get to. It doesn't have a sharp D-pad. Some controllers from the era had sharp D-pads that would hurt your thumb after a while. It doesn't have the pain disc that something like the Intellivision has. We've got the start and the select button. This is Super Nintendo Super NES controller model number SNES 005, made in Japan. Now, this particular Sega Genesis controller, and there's a lot of Sega Genesis controllers that you can choose from, but this is the base model, which I consider to be the best video game controller design of all time. Just this huge, awesome, super comfortable, wonderful controller that I spent so many hours playing Herzog Zwei and Phantasy Star 2 with. I have like 20 of these now, but this is model number 1650, just the good old fat Sega Genesis controller. These days I tend to lean towards the 6-button model, can't remember the model number offhand, but the one I use in the Musha film that won the controller contest. But this one just has a simple start button. This does not have the extra button on top. It's got the A, B, and C triggers and one of the greatest D-pads in existence. Both of these controllers give you plenty of cable length, which is nice. And to be honest, bias aside, they're terrific. Sega does what Nintendo don't. And the Super Nintendo does what the Sega controller don't. It has more buttons, but I personally prefer the shape of the Super Nintendo one. But you still can't go wrong with this. These are both great controllers. Comfortable, simple, buttons are in good positions, and comfortable buttons. Close-up look there at the buttons. Start, select, look at that D-pad. Just in case you aren't sure what direction you're pushing, they have arrows reminding you. How nice of them. Super Nintendo. This has not been QC passed by anyone, except Nintendo, I guess. Front buttons. And here's the Genesis controller, which also has convenient little arrows. And triggers. They're not buttons, they're triggers. Which controller is better? Whichever one you prefer, I think. There's no clear winner here because they're both good. I prefer this one, but this one's great also. So, I like the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. I mean, they both suck compared to the Vectrex, but what doesn't? not that I'm going to do this, because I don't want to break my wall, but you could throw either of these against the wall. You could back a truck over them, and they will still continue playing games. And if for some reason they don't, you can get a replacement one for like $5. So you really can't lose here. Either one. Sega Genesis controller, Super Nintendo controller. I would call it a tie, except Sega always wins in these cases. So personally, I prefer the Genesis controller, but the Super Nintendo one is great as well. And if for some reason you're not playing Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis, you should start immediately. Buy a Super Nintendo and a Genesis. That way you can play Thunder Spirits and Thunder Force 3. Sega does what In conclusion, which controller is better? Whichever one does not hit me in the head. This is actually kind of fun. This is like the G.I. Joe Tomahawk of controllers right here. Classic game room. As always, thank you for watching. You can pick up cool stuff like the Classic Game Room beer steins over at ClassicGameRoom.com. Surf Panda is my newest book, a kid's book, on Amazon.com. And of course, Jesus, the Coked Up Chicken, #1 and #2 are on Amazon.com.